Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week is arguably a very optimistic outcome and something that should at least make you feel slightly better. A child, specifically a baby, has received a partial heart transplant, and we have an update on what's happening there. And to turn your satisfaction to desperation and sadness, measles cases are soaring across the globe. But then again, hepatitis treatment for a common blood cancer might counter some of that disappointment. We have Alzheimer's being spread by a, thankfully, now banned injection. New microbes within your GI tract. The USDA has approved an exemption for a genetically modified berry, or series of berries in fact, and Japan's moonlander sends back images of its current circumstances. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with the infant heart transplant, but it's only a partial heart transplant, and that's one of the key things here. Beyond the fact that fitting an entire adult-sized heart in an infant is nigh on impossible, the other issue here is that even if that were the case, they may still require multiple surgeries after the fact. The whole idea of doing it this way, rather than doing a whole heart transplant or similar, is that they can only replace the valves and similar that were needed, specifically valves and vessels. The key in doing that is that A, it minimizes the amount of work required, but B, it means that there's less risk of rejection. After all, there's less tissue, and most of that tissue doesn't necessarily have the antigens to trigger the immune system. The other benefit to doing this as an infant is that the tissues will grow with the infant as they grow. This means there'll be no need to come back in 5, 10, 15, and even 20 years to, let's say, adjust the tissues, whether that involves completely new transplants or just trying to make what's there work. To be clear about it, the reason why doing it this way is so much better is that assuming that you're going to give the infant a transplant from a donor, an adult donor, there's about a 50% chance they'll die before 20. That's why this process is so much more promising. Going from news of infants to news that's related to failing to get an infant, or at least attempting to and possibly failing, STIs. In this case, the US is recognized they're currently dealing with an out-of-control STI epidemic. The CDC reports it as such, with more than 2.5 million cases of chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis currently being reported. Now, this could be a byproduct of lockdowns. With very little to do with your spare time except Netflix and chill, it makes sense that there be an increase in indoor activities. This could, in theory, have led to an increase in STIs. Whether you want to call them STIs, STDs, or anything else, it's up to you. The concern with this is, manifold to be blunt, one of which is simply that, any STI is going to have a direct impact on fertility and, if you are pregnant, significant issues to do with the baby's development and possibly successfully carrying the baby to term. The other is that, an increasing number of STIs are treatment resistant, whether it's gonorrhea, which is kind of terrifying, or if it's things like syphilis, which we've largely gotten rid of until recent times, but now it's back again, and then there are more again. In fact, it's so bad that there's nearly 1,000% increase in the number of cases. Yeah, that's how bad this is. 1,000% increase. 10 times more cases than there were previously. The further challenge with STIs is that a lot of them don't necessarily present with any major symptoms. So if you are an otherwise healthy and active individual, you're likely to not notice that you have them and then proceed to share the love. And unfortunately that means that more people infected and so on and so on. Until eventually you get to someone who does notice that they're sick and gets tested and suddenly, oh shit. And now you have to backtrack possibly 1, 2, or even dozens of individuals to figure out who was the first person to share, assuming it wasn't picked up at some sort of eyes wide shut party. In similar disease-related news, we have a huge increase, and honestly it's kind of ridiculous increase, in measles cases in Europe. Europe has seen a 45-fold, or basically a 4,500% increase in measles cases. Measles, something that in most countries in Europe was eradicated decades ago, and it's back again. And this all comes down to the issues of anti-vaxxers and their stupidity. Understand, we're not talking a small number here. We are talking a large number, although in the context of Europe, relatively small. 941 cases in 2022 versus 42,200 cases in 2023. The key here is that measles spreads very easily and very quickly. Because of that, those 42,000 and some cases easily will multiply. And unless there's herd immunity, it's going to keep on happening. This is down to Wakefield, fucking Wakefield, and his ridiculous "the MMR vaccine is bad for you" study, which was retracted and eventually led to Wakefield losing his medical license, which should tell you all you need to know about how bad that study was. And yet it really gave a kickstart to the anti-vaxxer movement, and particularly around measles, given MMR is for measles, mumps, and rubella. Moving on to actual studies of medication and treatments with concerns that are valid. And this comes down to Ozempic, the drug that's currently being used for weight loss, but was originally approved for diabetes. The concern with this, and let's be very clear, it's a concern because there's a link, not necessarily an explicit relationship, is that it may be contributing to rare psychiatric episodes. Let's be clear about this. It is a potential relationship, not necessarily an outright established one, and as such, the claims should be taken with a considerable amount of skepticism. It's not that the, let's say, relationship is impossible, and that's down to the fact that the Ozempic drug itself, the semaglutide, is acting as an analog for glucagon, and as such it's called a glucagon-like peptide. Anything that's acting like glucagon is acting like a hormone, and well, if you've ever dealt with somebody who is either going through menstruation or is arguably on something like birth control, the oral contraceptive, they may be experiencing various effects on their mood and personality due to the fact that, well, a hormone, just like this, is interfering with their mind to some extent. As a result, anything that is a hormone should be taken with caution. This does, however, bring us to what's actually being reported. Of the 481 events that were reported in the European Drug Database, about half were depression and 20% were suicidal ideation. So this is arguably something of a concern. Anxiety itself is generally not good, but suicidal ideation is very bad. There is a fairly major, let's say, flaw to the results we've mentioned, and that is, in terms of the European database, all of the reports are made voluntarily. It's effectively a similar idea to theirs, in that self-reported outcomes are made and they may not necessarily have any kind of relationship to the medication that the report is made in relation to. As such, it needs to be taken with, as mentioned, a lot of skepticism. In slightly more promising news, although arguably just as preliminary, we have how a hepatitis treatment could be contributing to a cancer treatment, specifically a blood cancer treatment. The relationship is, as said, very preliminary, but the effect is quite good, if true. The idea is you can treat multiple myeloma over several years with the use of the medication, and specifically the hepatitis B and hepatitis C virus vaccines. Further, if you're using antivirals that are targeting hepatitis B and hepatitis C, they will also contribute to reducing not only the risk of cancer, but theoretically, if it should develop in spite of this, it would contribute to reducing and certainly slowing down the progress of any cancer that did occur. It cannot be understated how important this is if true, and that's the key, if true, and it's because multiple myeloma is incurable. There is no known cure, and the problems with it are very simple. And because it's related to cells in the bone marrow, you effectively have these cells continue to proliferate but not be usable. As they proliferate, they eventually outcompete and fill up the space used by other cells. Importantly, cells like red blood cells. And so you are gradually suffocated by your own body not producing red blood cells and therefore unable to carry oxygen around your body. Because you can't carry oxygen, you don't get oxygen delivered, and you slowly experience hypoxia, leading to your death. Yes, you can get blood transfusions, but these are not necessarily a permanent solution. And that's why this study is so important. It removes one of the major ways that you could develop myelomas. Shifting to further drug-related news, but this time looking at Alzheimer's disease in particular, and a treatment from Biogen that was available. The drug was available from Biogen and had been approved by the FDA, but unfortunately the drug has now been withdrawn. Aduhelm was effectively available from mid-2021, and it was considered questionable, given that the FDA effectively went against its advisory panel who found that there was a lack of evidence to support its approval. Now, it's important for us to point out that Biogen is effectively doing this willingly, and they're doing it willingly for two reasons. One of which is that, well, the drug itself was incredibly controversial when it was approved, leading to all sorts of problems, including congressional investigation. The second, and this is perhaps the more likely reason that they're more than happy to do so, is that another drug called Ozempic was approved using the full regulatory hurdles and processes. This was in fact approved last year, and so they have an alternative that has zero of the baggage associated with it that Aduhelm did, but it's also just as effective as far as they're concerned, and so they can put all the money that they would have put into Aduhelm into their other drug instead, and thereby get more benefits. In further Alzheimer's news, we do have concerns about the increased number of possible cases, and the fact that there appeared to be a common source. Thankfully, a now banned injection. Yeah. One of the pathways by which Alzheimer's could have been, let's say, caused is that growth hormone was extracted from the brains of deceased individuals quite a long time ago, to be clear about this, but it was commonly used up until about 1985, so we're not talking an insignificant number of people who may have been injected with it. Thankfully, it was stopped, although the reason it was stopped probably not so much, the spread of prion disease, specifically Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. The other concern from this now is that those same injections may have also been spreading Alzheimer's disease. Yeah. It's a concern, a not insignificant concern. As said, the reason for it is very simple. It is entirely possible that the same way organ transplants, blood transfusions, and tissue transplants could well have been spreading prion diseases, it may also have been spreading Alzheimer's disease, this time literally using the unfortunate growth hormone extracted from the brains of deceased individuals. The worry is that there is a very high rate. It's not quite 75% of individuals who received these injections are now exhibiting symptoms consistent with Alzheimer's disease. Now, understand, most of these individuals are in their 40s and upwards, but nonetheless, it's still a very worrying figure. Further worrying news this week has supplements under fire once more, and for very good reason. Well, a more good reason than the usual criticisms of supplements. In this case, the FDA is squarely taking aim, a supplement that contains tianeptine. This is also sometimes given the colloquial name of gas station heroin. It's a synthetic drug, and it's generally intended to have exactly the same effects, which is to relax you and deal with some pain. It's prescriptively used for the treatment of depression, but it also carries not insignificant addiction issues, and obviously if you're addicted to something, withdrawal when you don't have access to it. Since it's sold in America, unsurprisingly, as a supplement rather than a prescription medication, you do need to have concerns, since it's relatively easily accessed, and, well, as mentioned, it has some pretty big issues. This leads us to the FDA's warning, and the fact that they've been continuing to warn individuals for more than 2 years now. The gist of it is that it doesn't meet the definition of a dietary ingredient, and therefore shouldn't be listed as a supplement, but also, well, it's unsafe, mostly because it's a supplement in manufacturing terms and how it's sold. Therefore, it is completely free of any kind of regulatory hurdles or regulation full stop. It means you may be getting exactly what you think you're buying, or you might be getting a cocktail of who knows what. It could be tianeptine and any number of other different supplements. The reason why supplement companies can basically get away with going Walter White on this is that the DEA has no power to stop them. And that's because the drug itself, and it is a drug even though it's not a medication, is not designated as a Schedule 1 drug in America, meaning that the DEA has no power to do anything about it. Shifting to news that's slightly more promising, but arguably just as questionable, and not really arguably, it's definitely questionable. It claims that tomato juice can kill salmonella. Now, importantly, the findings have no relationship to the acidity of the tomato juice, which would be your first thought, and frankly was ours. That is, that tomato juice is very obviously something that is a rather acidic substance, and therefore most bacteria don't survive well in it. It's why when you can tomato sauce, the bacteria that are likely to survive in there are actually those that form spores. The spores can survive in the acidic environment and the high heat of the canning process, and eventually re-emerge and cause all sorts of grief. In this case, the research was looking at salmonella, which is not a spore former, thankfully, but also responsible for a large number of outbreaks of disease, whether it's something like typhoid, which is a problem, but also in recent years in America, outbreaks of salmonella related to chickens. In this particular study, it wasn't necessarily the acidity as mentioned. Rather, it was two peptides that are made as part of the tomato and therefore present in the juice. Those two particular, let's say, proteins were able to cause all sorts of problems with the salmonella itself. And not just can they kill them off, but, well, in relative terms, fairly short order. As much as 24 hours, so it is an extensive time frame, but at the very low end, it's about 45 minutes. This does mean that, in theory, given that some of the salmonella strains that were tested were antibiotic resistant, this could be a pathway to develop a quasi-treatment for salmonella that's antibiotic resistant using peptides derived from tomatoes. Of course, all of this research is effectively being conducted in test tubes and, as noted, anything, if given an adequate dose, will cause the death of anything else in a test tube, So take it how you will, it's certainly not definitive findings. Slightly more substantial, although arguably not much more so, is what is called a new class of life within the GI tract, although it's close enough to a virus not to truly be novel in those terms. This research needs to be taken with an extreme degree of skepticism, largely because it's a preprint publication. A preprint is a way of going, we found this awesome and amazing thing, and now we want the world to know about our findings because we think they're so great, although they may be bullshit, much like the room temperature superconductor. These newly discovered virus-like structures are called obelisks. The obelisks are made up of RNA, and the reason they're compared to a virus is very simply the fact that they have no cell to them. There is no organelle system, they are just nucleotides. As a result, they effectively exist independent of most of what we would consider a living organism, and so the closest comparison to them is a virus. This is also arguably where things get kind of weird. They're all very short sequences of RNA. They're about 1,000 nucleotides long, which is, in comparative terms, tiny, especially for something that's basically a genome, for something weird and wonderful. All of the gene sequences within it appear to belong to basically proteins that they suspect are involved in entry into the bacteria. And to be clear about it, they found these weird obelisks in a lot of bacteria. In some instances, up to 50% of oral samples. Admittedly, in other cases it's as low as 10%, but that's still a very prevalent scenario. And the fact that they're so common makes it all the weirder. But it also explains why they haven't really been seen before. Such a short gene sequence, or more accurately genome, is simply something that gets overlooked in a lot of studies, given that most genomes are much more than 1,000 nucleotides long. However, as mentioned, very preliminary research, arguably entirely unassessed by people who are much more knowledgeable in this subject matter, and so on, means that this is possibly just a very bad screw-up by somebody. And next we have a slightly more promising avenue of investigation into proteins and the way that a certain group of proteins may be related to cancer spread and therefore a means of stopping it. Understand, again, a preliminary and certainly needs far more research, which honestly is not that unusual when it comes to any kind of academia, but in this case it's not just to prove what they're claiming in other models, but also to find ways to use it if proven true, and that's a big if. What they found is that there's a certain protein, it's called MYC. MYC is involved in the promotion of cancer cells. Therefore, when it's freely floating around, it finds its way to a cancer cell and suddenly cancer proliferates and you have your problem. On the other hand, the researchers here, those from the University of California, Riverside, have found a way to develop a peptide that can bind to MYC and therefore prevent that interaction with the cancer cells, thereby preventing, to a certain extent, the proliferation of the cancer cells. This would, in theory, slow down the growth of the cancer cell by a significant degree. More importantly, kind of anyway, is just how useful it would be if true. That is, if true, this would be able to used in the treatment of up to 75% of all cancers. And now for the not insignificant caveat to it. The findings are based on not just cell culture, which already as mentioned, take that with a lot of skepticism, but a very specific cell culture. They used human brain cancer cells, and as such, this may not have any bearing on just about any other cell type, which is a concern. There's also the fact that the peptide that they're going to be targeting has an important role to play in normal cell function, and particularly normal cell proliferation. Yes, it's suddenly upregulated and it has a more significant impact on cancerous cells, but it's also used by normal cells, meaning that if you're going to be targeting it, you're going to have to want to be really, really specific about how you use it. If not, it's going to be similar to chemotherapy, which targets all cells in the body and stops them from dividing. Shifting to slightly more promising news, and it's news from America. Pairwise, a company responsible for berries, has received USDA approval to be exempted from the genetic modifications list of, let's say, products. This means the berries that they're responsible for can effectively be sold as an otherwise normal berry product, and not as a genetic modification. The reason they're able to get this is that what they've done could have been achieved using conventional breeding methods. However, those breeding methods would have taken a very long time, been much more difficult, and obviously involved a lot more hassle. This is why the 9 plants, that they applied for the exemption for have effectively allowed them to make huge steps forward and therefore sell their product at a much quicker time frame and much lower cost. The 9 features, let's say, that they got the exemption for are then being applied to 19 different berries. The features include things like being seedless, thornless, and having a higher yield. Importantly, these changes were achieved using CRISPR, but because of what they are, and the fact that they are, for all intents and purposes, completely comparable to otherwise conventionally modified or bred plants, there is no real issue in treating them as such. It's kind of amazing you have to go through so much hassle for this, but at least the USDA is recognizing that this is actually a thing. Now we have news that's completely out of this world, although it's actually come back to this world. It's that NASA has finally opened the Bennu samples that were brought back. Understand, these have been sitting in storage for a while now. Well, storage isn't really true. It's just that they're being very delicate in getting them out and in how they're handling it. The reason they've had to be delicate is that the capsule that contained the bulk of the sample was stuck. The fasteners that were holding it closed, at least 2 of them, were not budging. Unfortunately, the usual engineer's flowchart of how to deal with this doesn't really work. You can't take a hammer to the capsule itself, owing to the simple fact that you would disturb the contents. And since the capsule's contents was not only an incredibly slow collection, but incredibly expensive, you don't want to be destroying or damaging it. Certainly not if you're going to be the individual responsible for doing so. Also consider that there's only 70 or so grams, 2.5 ounces of material. The other issue and reason for this is that in order to be able to open it, NASA had to make specific tools, and importantly, the tools they use have to be tested and approved before going into the sealed biohazard box. The reason they have to do it this way is to ensure that the samples within it are not contaminated, and they have to meet certain other milestones, for example, being non-magnetic and made of stainless steel. As such, it takes a very long time to get them through all the necessary hurdles before they can be put into the box and used to open up the sample. This is why the 70 grams have remained within the collection itself, but thankfully there were another 70 grams that were not contained within it that were able to be not only tested but distributed to collaborators. Going further into space, we have Japan's moon lander, and that it's sending back its first images of the lunar surface. The images are kind of lonely and sad, but also amazing, largely owing to the fact that they are black and white images. The reason we are getting relatively basic imaging is simply down to the fact that when Japan's lunar lander landed, it landed in a rather unconventional manner. That unconventional manner was nose first, meaning that a lot of damage happened, including to the solar panels. The solar panels that were needed to power said lander, and so the rover is pretty much unable to do much of anything. Although the lander itself is absolutely buggered, the rovers are not, and there are two of them. One is a shape-shifting rover made by the people who have been involved in the toy company behind Transformers, and the other is a somewhat more conventional rover. The hope, and this is a somewhat optimistic hope, is that if sunlight should happen to hit the solar panels, theoretically they could start generating power once more, and therefore the lander itself might be able to power up again. Finally, we have very optimistic, although also very tenuous, news from the furthest point out in space that we've launched a lander to, and therefore rover, Mars. The, let's say, claim is that Perseverance may have already found life on Mars. Not Martian life, sadly, but at least it's something. The cause for this incredible optimism is laid in several ways. First of all, the robotic explorer is currently sitting in a crater. The crater is reasonably confidently labelled as once having contained water, and obviously without water there, it's now a dried out lake bed. The belief, based on the, let's say, deep scanning of it, and we'll get to exactly what they're doing shortly, indicates that if there is anywhere, this is likely to be the location for extraterrestrial life. This is where the ground-penetrating radar can not just scan at multiple layers, but look at whether or not those multiple layers are the result of just natural phenomena, that is, environmental conditions and theoretically life, or if it is the product of geological activity. Because it can penetrate up to 10 meters or 30 freedom units down below, and in rocky soil up to 20 meters, roughly 60 feet, it's able to analyze to quite a depth and therefore get a much better idea about what's happening. The key here is rather than just being a lake, it's the ebb and flow of water within the lake that is important. If Mars was anything like Earth, the movement of water in and out, and the fact that there was a at least somewhat long-term watery environment, it would provide the opportunity and place for microbial life. And this is where sedimentary samples are important. Those sedimentary samples could prove whether or not there are organic compounds present. This does, however, bring us to a rather major flaw to these claims. Any kind of analysis of the samples, and understand there are a lot of samples given that the rover itself is about 60% full, would require collecting said samples, and rather obviously, that's a problem. How are you going to collect samples when, well, to be clear about it, it's all the way on Mars with no way to get back? Yeah. This will take quite a while, and as such, without plans at the moment to be able to figure out what's going on, we're basically stuck waiting. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.